Can you believe that the ears on this bunny were painted in just 15 minutes using the three-step process? The three-step process is a system for painting watercolor where you paint with water, drop in color, and then finish with texture techniques. A library of all the texture techniques that I like to use is available as a PDF in the video's description. We used the three-step process when we painted the fish with 3 colors in lesson 1. We will do it again when we paint this bunny and this bird. Now, I've had the question asked, why can't you just paint with color right away? Why do you have to put the water down and then the color down? The short answer is that often causes hard edges, and it doesn't allow your colors to mix very well on the paper itself. But let me explain that a little bit better in this demo. I have a wet brush and a heavy mix of paint onto dry paper. So I'm directly painting paint onto paper. I'm trying to have a nice wet brush, fill it with as much paint and water as I can on a single brush. I'm even going to add in some color, like I would typically do in the three-step process. Now I'm going to do the same thing on this side. I have a wet brush on dry paper, but this time I'm painting with plain water first. Now I'm going to drop in heavy mixes of color into the plain water. Trying to do a similar thing by putting the ultramarine blue down here and the cobalt teal up here and seeing how they mix together. There's 3 big differences between these 2 approaches. Number 1 is drying time. Typically, when we paint with water, we're able to use more water. So this one will give us more time to work with the pigment before it dries. Number 2 is edges. This one, because it dries faster, will give you less time to manipulate these edges. So if I wanted to go in, pull color, this area is still pretty wet. You just have to move a little bit faster and you won't quite have as much to work with. Over here, we have a lot of time, this is still very wet, to manipulate these edges. And number 3 is that you can see how this square, because it had more water, the color is mixing in more interesting ways. It's just more dynamic, there's more granulation, and it's not quite as flat as this. So it's because of these 3 reasons that I recommend the 3-step process of painting with water, dropping in color, and finishing with texture techniques. What we want to avoid is approaching watercolor as if it was acrylic or oil paint. As watercolor artists, we have to consider water. So unless I'm working in a small area of precision or detail, I almost never paint directly with paint onto my paper. But there is an exception to the 3-step process, where I will paint directly with paint onto my paper. Areas that have high detail and precision, or areas that are too small, it just doesn't make as much sense to paint with water first and then drop in color, because usually those areas already have hard edges anyway. And we don't need to see a lot of color mixing happening in those small, tight areas. And it's also a possibility that we might want to give ourselves some outlines to work with before we start the 3-step process, which is the case when I paint dog noses and eyes. I will typically paint with a black outline and then do the 3-step process to fill in the other colorful details. So now you know the process of how I paint. But there are 3 other things I want you to consider as you're painting. Sections, edges, and layers. Typically when I start a painting, after I trace it out, I plan out my techniques and I plan out my colors, and I usually already have an idea of the sections I'm going to paint in what order. Typically I start with the eyes, as these can require a few layers. The nose also requires a few layers, so I'll usually do that next. Then I'll usually paint the ears, which is my favorite part to paint, the dark side of the painting, and then the light side of the painting. Now, we haven't covered dark side and light side quite yet because we haven't done the video about contrast, but my portraits typically I like to have them have a dark side and a light side because it makes them a lot more interesting and dramatic. But the key is you can't overpaint the light side because then your dark side won't be dark. They'll both be dark. So I usually paint the dark side and then I know just how much the light side needs in order to not match the dark side. Here's a few examples in my past paintings of light sides and dark sides. You can see my black bear clearly has a light side and a dark side. This portrait of my dad has a light side and a dark side. This portrait of my cat Augie has a light side and a dark side. This portrait of my other cat Saru has a light side and a dark side. This portrait of Moose has a light side and a dark side. And I know all of you are excited to paint the light side and the dark side of this bunny in our upcoming lesson. But don't get too overwhelmed thinking about light side and dark side for this lesson. What I want you to think about is planning your painting, deciding what techniques you're going to use for each section of your painting. Here we're painting the bunny ears. I'm speeding this up, but you can see that we paint both ears in one 3-step process. Starting with one ear, I paint with water, I drop in color, and then I finish with texture techniques, including the exciting use of that grainer brush to depict the hair on the edge of the bunny's ear. Then I repeat that 3-step process on the other ear. But layers is actually built into the 3-step process. Oftentimes, we're going to paint with water, we're going to drop in our color, and we're finishing with texture techniques. But depending on the technique you're using, you might need your paper to be wet, almost dry, or dry. So that's where the layers piece comes in. You might need to layer your texture techniques. But for the most part, once you do the painting with water and the dropping in color, after that, it's more about texture techniques on top, in layers if needed. The third thing I mentioned was edges. The thing with watercolor is once it dries, about the only thing you can do with it at that point, if you want to manipulate whatever edge that it dried into creating, is to soften it by lifting some of the pigment off the edge. So we want to consider what our edges are going to look like before that paint dries. With this bunny, we have some hard edges that after we added that color, we just let it be and we let it dry in a sharp edge. We have some furry edges that we finished with the grainer brush while it was still wet. And we also have some soft edges. You can see where we pulled color from the ear into the background, the edges of where that paint dried. You can kind of tell because watercolor pigment typically likes to kind of travel to the edge and settle there. And oftentimes it'll dry with this kind of pretty little outline. A lot of watercolor artists actually lean into this look, and I think it looks really good. But it is something you need to know is a characteristic of watercolor while you're painting in case you want to either lean into that or avoid it. Long story short, plan out your sections, understand that you might need to do a few layers of texture techniques, and always think about your edges before the paint dries. Remember, you can get my whole library of texture techniques as a PDF in the video's description. And as always, your supply list is waiting for you at paint333.com. If you have a favorite way of working in watercolor that has helped you succeed, please let us know in the comments. I read each and every one of your comments, and I appreciate wholeheartedly all of your likes and everyone who's subscribed and everybody who's given a video or a comment a thumbs up. Tomorrow we are finishing out this week's set of Mastering Watercolor videos by tackling some common beginner roadblocks and answering your most frequently asked questions. Chances are you have a question that we'll answer in tomorrow's video. So see you then, and happy painting.